Hello, my name is Allison Smith. I'm a professor in the history department here at the University of Toronto. I was a JHI fellow in the fall of 2018 for a project that I'm calling The Case of the Dead Cheese Master. This is a project that I've been working on and off for a few years, and I'd like to talk to you today a bit about the evolution of the project over time, starting with an anecdote of the dead cheese master of the title's death, and then sort of moving back and forth through time a little bit, thinking about how this one minor story from history can open up a lot of different ideas about how we do history, what history really means, and the kinds of information that we can get out of sometimes seemingly tangential or minor issues. So my story to begin takes place in the environment around St. Petersburg. And here we've got a map showing St. Petersburg up in the top right, and the coast of the Gulf of Finland sort of going around the edge here. Early on the morning of August 8th, 1799, not far out of St. Petersburg, near the village of Panova, which is down here, a peasant named Pavel Spiridonov, a local police official, found a dead body. According to the official report about this case, Spiridonov found a dead male unknown body and nearby it a saddled bay horse. He quickly informed other local policing officials, and two men were called out to investigate further. One was a district doctor to investigate the state of the body. The other was the officer in charge of public order along the road that ran from St. Petersburg to one of the many suburban palaces in the area called Peterhof, a little bit further to the west along the shore of the Gulf of Finland. They discovered that there were no particular signs of foul play. The body showed no signs of fighting, as the report went. And it seems that his death happened suddenly, again, according to the report. The district doctor furthermore noted that gangrene had actually set into the body, probably due to frequent use of hard spirits. So this suggested that this was not some sort of violent crime, but rather that the man had either been drunk, fallen off the horse, and died from the fall, or that his apparently persistent habit of drinking had caused some sort of attack that led to him eventually falling off the horse. The only other thing that was immediately apparent was that, and here I quote, "This unknown man was probably of moderate means, for he had as clothing a dark green flannel overcoat, a coat and waistcoat of coffee-colored cloth, white linen trousers, and a fine cloth shirt. And beyond that, nothing else was found on him." Now that actually turns out to be untrue. He also had a sack of documents, but for some reason that doesn't show up in the initial report. After several days of investigation, the mystery of the man's identity, at least, was solved. He turned out to be a Swiss man named Francois Tinguely, who had been employed as a maker of cheese by another one of the imperial palaces in the area, a palace called Gatchina, that was a particular favorite location and place of the then Emperor Paul. Now, I came across this event as part of my larger research into the workings of this particular palace and the larger estate that surrounds it. I came to this project in a sort of circuitous way, or maybe not exactly circuitous, but it wasn't something that I had particularly planned to do. I somewhat randomly, on a research trip to Russia, decided to take a beautiful summer Sunday and go outside of the city of St. Petersburg itself to one of the palaces. This is a very common sort of way to spend a lovely summer or winter, for that matter, day getting out of the city. And I chose Gatchina mostly because I hadn't been there before, and I'd been to some of the other palaces as well. Now, there are, again, a number of different palaces in the area. Again, if we've got St. Petersburg up here, Gatchina at this point is the furthest south right here. There's another cluster of palaces here, one known as Pavlovsk and one known as the Catherine Palace in what was in imperial times known as Tsarskoye Selo, or the Tsar's village, but which was renamed in the Soviet era as Pushkin after the great Russian poet. And here's Peterhof, the other very famous one that's along the water. Now, Gatchina is particularly associated with two Russian emperors, and I'll just show them here. Emperor Paul, who's the one who owned it at the time of this case of the dead cheese master, and then his great grandson, I think I've got that right, Alexander III, who lived there in the 1880s and 1890s. They're both known as particularly autocratic czars, and they both lived in this palace in very different ways. And something about this recognition of these two men and their very different ways of living in this palace was what really pulled me into the idea that it might be an interesting place to focus research when I was done working on the project that I was in Russia at the time working on. The reason for this has a lot to do with the exhibit within the palace itself. This grand central part of the building is, a classic late 18th century grandiose sort of palace filled with brocades and elaborate carvings and plasterwork and fine fabrics. And even now, when it was heavily damaged during the Second World War and has since been restored, it really still gives this vision of the world of opulence and luxury that I think we tend to think with a lot of sort of 18th century royal visions. But the family of Alexander III didn't live in these sort of fancy palace rooms. Instead, they actually lived in in rooms along the side that were much, you just have to say, cozy. They felt much more of a sort of Victorian comfort than grand, opulent, autocratic display. And the juxtaposition of the rooms, of the figures of these czars, of a few other things, really led me to think that this might be an interesting place to spend some time thinking about. Now, it took me a while to sort of get back in and sort of start tackling this project. And on my first trip back to Russia, when I started to delve into the archives, it was a bit of a planning trip. I only had a few weeks and for various reasons, the archives would only allow me to order a few files a day. And this turned out to be sort of a problem because it turned out that the archival files for the Palace of Gatchina, the town of Gatchina that lies right next to it, and you can kind of see this even on this map right here. There's the palace, but there's also a town that runs right next to it. And also a lot of the villages in the area, because they were all part of this larger estate, turned out to be sort of remarkably well documented. Of course, there are gaps, but there's still an enormous amount of material in there. But because I was only allowed to order a few things, I let myself not be rigorous in any particular way and just order files because the name of the file sounded like it might be something interesting. And this sort of paid mixed dividends, I suppose I would say. So I ordered a file titled "On Delivering a Donkey for the Imperial Theaters to Take Part in the Ballet Don Quixote," which turns out to be interesting, but most of its interest is actually sort of covered in that title. It was simply a letter that was sent from the director of the Imperial Theaters to the main administrator of the Gatchina Palace Authority, telling him that the donkey currently playing the role of Sancho Panza's noble steed had died, no others were to be found in St. Petersburg, and did Gatchina have one to spare? As it turned out, they did. They sent one and named a price, and eventually the donkey transfer was achieved. So this is a lovely little anecdote, I think, but it's sort of hard to imagine much more about this file, at least from the Gatchina side. I suspect that if one were thinking about the theatrical side, there'd be a whole bunch more to think about. But at least for this moment, or for my purposes, the file just seemed to be a little self-contained glimpse of a momentary intersection between two worlds. I also ordered a file titled "The Matter," or as I sort of slightly freely translating as "The Case," of the dead cheesemaster Tingley, turned out to hold much more, although also to hold many gaps and challenges of understanding and interpretation. Now, when I first ordered it, I really did order it on largely a whim. I thought it was a fascinating file when I saw it for reasons that will become clear, but I still didn't really think that I would do very much with it as a scholar. I couldn't imagine how it might fit into the larger project that I went in thinking that I would be researching, which was going to focus on autocracy and governance and systems of control. But I found myself increasingly drawn both to this file and to several other files that told sort of smaller, self-contained stories about people who might normally never make it into the historical record. And yet whose stories seem to illuminate things about the world of Imperial Russia that I hadn't really fully thought of before. And so in the end, I found myself working on two books simultaneously. The one that I initially thought that I would write about autocracy as envisioned in this place of Gatchina, under the control of these two autocrats plus several others along the way. But also a second book that lets me dive into some of these individual files or stories in greater depth. So tentatively called The Case of the Dead Cheese Master and Other Stories, I'm envisioning this book, or I'm writing this book as a series of small scale sort of deep dives into histories and stories from around this palace and the town and the villages in the area. Now, a bunch of the chapters are actually almost finished, but the one I'm finding toughest to crack is the title story, which is the one that I actually wrote my grant proposal that got me this JHI fellowship about. So funnily enough, this one that captured the imagination is in some ways the least finished. But that's exactly why I want to talk about it now. One of the real challenges of unpacking an archival file like this one is the act of archiving itself. A file, at least the kinds that I get, may hold many individual documents, letters, reports, petitions, complaints, personal documents like passports or bills of exchange. Some have additional notes scrawled in the margins. Others, you get multiple drafts of the same document, so you can compare and see how things changed in the minds of certain bureaucrats or others. They're not always assembled in chronological order, even just considering the pure papers that are in there, the letters and others. Even if the documents are in order, the story they contain may still be disjointed. A petition or a complaint may start off a file, but often the investigation that ensues goes back in time to before the moment of the complaint. And so you really do sort of jump back and forth between different times in the process of just reading through a file as it is presented to you. Sometimes two files end without a clear resolution, either because the case didn't have one, or because you're getting only a part of a larger case, one of the investigative arms of something, and the final resolution happened in a different body that never reported back on the final resolution of the case. So as a result of this, I, at least, often find the act of reading through an archival file to be like reading a novel that is very modernist and plays with time in all sorts of confusing ways. Turning the page can lead me to some sort of piece of new information that has actually led me to gasp aloud in the archive, and even tear up from time to time as I came across a sad turn of events in a story, again, I call them stories. They are obviously real things that happen to real people, but something about the act of having been put on paper in this way does sort of lead to this way of thinking about them. The last page sometimes has me almost tearing out my hair in frustration because I don't know how things end. Now, if I were to explore the story of the dead cheese master strictly according to the archival file about him, it would start not with his death, but with the fate of the things he left behind. The first pages of his file set out responsibility for the cheese-making operation he oversaw after his death. They include lists of his property, ranging from all sorts of different clothes and linens, interesting a bear coat of Polish design, 5 silver tablespoons, and some other items, and various papers that he left behind, contracts and passports. Really only about a third to a half of the way through do the circumstances of his death begin to come clear. And even then, they're fairly quickly left behind, and the bulk of the file again returns to the question of property and ownership. Only in the papers and passports and in a few pages at the end of the file are there any glimpses of his life beyond this moment of his death. So focusing just on those papers, in that order or not, feels like a fairly unsatisfying way to tell a story. But so too would be an effort to retell his story in a strictly chronological accounting. That feels like it leaves out some of the specialness of the file itself and the ways that his story was preserved or at times not preserved in the archival record. I think in a lot of ways about a wonderful quote from Carlo Ginzburg, who is one of the sort of founding figures of the idea of microhistory, which this project really is. Microhistory, again, is the idea of trying to look at something on a very small scale in order to understand something much larger about society, about economy, about culture, about beliefs, all sorts of things. His most famous work is a book called The Cheese and the Worms, and you can maybe see why I'm particularly drawn to this. And he has a lovely quote in a later piece in which he sort of mulls about some of the ideas of what microhistory is and what it really means as an act of history. He notes that in his book, he says, I had set out to reconstruct the intellectual, moral, and fantastic world of the Miller Minocchio on the basis of sources generated by persons who sent him to the stake. This, in some ways paradoxical project could translate itself into an account that filled the gaps in the documentation to form a polished service. It could, but obviously it should not, for reasons that were of a cognitive, ethical, and aesthetic order. The obstacles interfering with the research were constituent elements of the documentation, and thus had to become part of the account. The same for the hesitations and silences of the protagonist in the face of his persecutor's question, or mine. Thus the hypotheses, the doubts, the uncertainties became part of the narration. The search for truth became part of the exposition of the necessarily incomplete truth attained. So I'd like today, for a bit longer, to talk through the story of this particular figure from the past by focusing on the research project and the ways that different efforts of looking through archival records or other ways of thinking about the past help to bring this one person's life into greater focus. Now, my first trip to the archives, when I first ordered this file, the thing that became most clear was actually the importance of cheese in the story. And I know that that sounds very silly, but the bulk of the file really does center on the question of who owned the cheeses that Tigli had produced and left behind. As it turned out, he had been moonlighting from his official job making cheese for the Gatchina estate by renting land and cows from an estate near where he died. So the Gatchina authorities and the owner of that land and those cows engaged in a lengthy struggle over the ownership of the cheeses that had been produced there. Now, the reason for all of this was that cheese was valuable, which may or may not be a surprise. Russia actually doesn't really have an indigenous tradition of aged cheeses. Fresh cheese, absolutely, but not so much the aged cheeses like a Gruyere or certain other kinds of Western European cheeses. But over the course of the 18th century, Russian elites very definitely developed a taste for imported cheeses from Western Europe. There's a wonderful anecdote from the reign of Peter the Great from the beginning of the 18th century involving a particularly tasty Limburger cheese. And by the last decades of the century, a taste for various kinds of imported cheeses seems to have been fairly well developed. Some model budgets for noble households sort of took it as a given that English cheese, Parmesan, Dutch cheese, and Swiss cheeses would all be part of your average noble person's yearly expenses at sometimes really significant amounts. Import records also show that there was a lot of cheese entering the country every year. In 1793 to 95, for example, importers brought in an average declared value of 121,300 rubles worth of cheese every year. So as a taste for cheese developed, so too did calls to produce more cheese in Russia. And the main way that people decided to do this was by hiring foreigners to produce and to make cheese. So this seems to be exactly what happened at this Gatchina estate. Emperor Paul, or actually at the time still Grand Duke Paul, still the heir to the throne, followed suit. So this was in a lot of ways my major takeaway from that first trip, a recognition of the role that cheese itself played at this particular moment in time. But I still had a lot of questions about how this man, in a position of what would presumably be a fair bit of authority, called in for his expert knowledge, who seems to be of reasonable means, who is presumably chosen to come to Russia to work, had in 1799 become a confirmed and habitual drunkard, or so it appears, and had been brought low to die in a rather sad manner by drunkenly falling off a horse, as it most likely seems. So by the time I went back to the archives a couple of years later, I had decided that this story was interesting enough that I wanted to try to figure out some of the answers to this. And so as I worked through a lot of other archival files from this era, I particularly kept an eye out for the presence of this man, this Francois Tigli. So I found that he had come to Russia in 1791 and started working for the Gatchina authorities in 1792. And remember, he dies in 1799. Now, another Swiss man named Balthasar Jenny seems to have been in charge of the cheesemaking operation at the palace, or not literally at the palace, but on its grounds at first. But in 1797, Tingley signed a contract to run things there. And this is actually an image of the contract. It's interestingly dual written with Russian on one side and German on the other. He promised in the course of this contract to produce cheese, to share his veterinary knowledge, and to teach cheesemaking to students chosen from among the local peasants in Gatchina. Now, in the wider archival record, he shows up here and there during these years, asking for help to recover a debt, a few other places. But in an interesting way, his absence in the archival record also, I think, tells part of his story. So Tingley was not the only foreigner working for the Gatchina authorities at this time. There were two men also with jobs around the palace, and I'll do this. So here we've got Gatchina. The palace itself is right here, and you can see here these extensive gardens, and this was actually a deer park, but these sort of extensive lands around it. This area right here was what had been the village of Gatchina, which was during the reign of Emperor Paul turned into officially a town at this point, and remains a town to this day. So the other two foreigners working for the palace were a man named James Hackett, who is an English or possibly Irish, it's a little confusing in the record, chief gardener who had worked there since before Paul even owned this palace. And also a stonemason named Placido Visconti, who was a Swiss-Italian master stonemason who played a very important role in these years of extending the palace structures, building new ones. Paul really committed quite a bit once he became Tsar in 1796 to building up the palace. He even had before that when he was still the heir to the throne. So the stonemason had quite a bit of work to do. So these three men are all here, but Tingley seems to have led a very different life in comparison to the other two. One of the kinds of records that I had access to were the daily sort of logs of the palace administration, which actually governed not just the palace, but also the town, the villages that were part of the estate as well. And they list all the people who came into the offices when it was open and what their business was. Both Hackett and Visconti appear fairly regularly in these records. Now that may have been because they were located closer to the palace itself, and also because they were perpetually signing agreements with contractors because of the kinds of work that they did. But still, they were regular presences in a lot of ways. They also seem to have had a fairly uncomplicated relationship. Visconti did, leave Russia during this time period. He asked to be released from his contract, was actually granted a bonus of 1,000 rubles and thanks for his service, and he and his family who had come with him left. But that said, he is the only one of the three who ever signed things in Cyrillic letters, which suggests that he actually worked to learn some Russian. And it seems to have been a fairly unproblematic tenure there. Hackett was actually there for the long term. He had arrived in Russia in 1777 and remained there until his death in 1833. After he had retired and taken a pension, he stayed living in the area. When he died, he actually left the income from one of his investments to the people of Gatchina to be used for their well-being and thanks for their hospitality. And for that point, really up until virtually the revolution in 1917, the income from this investment was used to give small awards of money to peasants and townspeople from the area, just if they had need. There's remarkable records for this as well. Tingley, though, rarely comes in comparison. And some of this may have been that he mostly lived not in Gatchina proper, but in one of the other villages associated with the palace. But none of this is particularly far away, and apologies for something ringing in the background. He was producing cheese, it was being sold, and it seems like things were going reasonably well, even if he was perhaps not quite as active as anything else. In 1798, however, things started to go badly for him. For one thing, a rivalry between Tingley and one other member of the palace administration seems to really develop over the spring and summer of 1798. The administrator, a man named Unge, asked for permission to actually set up a rival cheesemaking operation on the palace grounds, was granted that, and started producing cheese on his own. And then the end of 1798 brought a disaster. A very infectious cattle disease. The first reports came in late October. The disease showed up in one of the villages on the larger estate. 3 cows died and another 3 had fallen ill immediately. And although the palace administration ordered that precautions be taken to avoid its spread, it turned out to be very difficult to do so. The reason this impacted Tingley is that he had been hired not only to make cheese, but also because of his presumed veterinary knowledge. So he was called in to add his expertise to the question. The main leader of the estate sort of demanded that his opinion be sought on the danger presented by the disease, whether it was a normal infection or a dangerous one, and was asked to do all he could to protect the healthy from infection. Although Tingley did declare this to be a dangerous, not a normal disease, whether because the infection was particularly serious or because there were simply very few ways actually to fight illness once it set in this sort of pre-antibiotic world, any efforts he made were, it seems, largely unsuccessful. The disease simply spread through the area, despite efforts that even brought in provincial authorities trying to route traffic around the affected area. Now, on the one hand, there probably wasn't that much he could actually have done, but still, he must have been both held responsible and perhaps also felt himself responsible in some way. So this cannot have been an easy time. Also, over the course of that autumn and winter, one man who appears to have been Tingley's friend, a medic named Biedermann, committed suicide in somewhat mysterious circumstances. So there's this other source of potential trauma. Now, although Tingley continued to produce cheese during this whole period, or at least cheese continued to be sold, these were 2 bad things to really happen. And something else happened, although what exactly is unclear, over the course of this winter, the winter of 1798 to 1799. Now, this would have been his 8th winter in what is, I have to say, cold, dark, dank, and gloomy St. Petersburg area. I love St. Petersburg perhaps more than any other city, but it is indeed dark and gloomy in the depths of winter. The scale of the problem that resulted from whatever happened to his mental state, or perhaps something else, wasn't uncovered until the spring. But at that point, it seemed clear that he had simply fallen down on the job in a pretty egregiously terrible way. He had allowed several dozen sheep and calves to freeze to death over the course of the winter. This, of course, resulted in a lot of censure from the palace authorities and also from much heavier oversight over his operations. Among other things, a newly constructed farm on the Gatchina grounds, which is actually this tiny little building right here, was given a little bit more of a role to play in the cheese-making operation of the area. Now, perhaps this is why at some point in early 1799, Tingley had started this moonlighting operation, making cheese on his own. Perhaps it was to escape oversight. Perhaps he'd grown tired of life in Russia and hoped to earn enough extra money to leave in a prosperous way. He was earning a good salary, 1,000 rubles a year, which is more than almost anybody else employed by the palace made. But on the other hand, he had at least one investment go wrong, a debt that he was unable to call in. So perhaps his financial situation was actually more precarious than his salary implies. In any event, later that year in 1799, his Russian sojourn of nearly a decade came to a sad end. Now, this leads to another question, which is what brought him to Russia in the first place? The archival file that I initially ordered tells us a few things. He left behind papers that shows that he was from a village called Marsin in the canton of Fribourg in Western Switzerland. And so here's Fribourg is the little blue thing here, and the red dot is approximately where Marsin is. This is actually near Gruyere, which is perhaps why he had a fair bit of cheese knowledge to begin with. Although what it mostly seems from these documents is that he had been, above all, a trader in cattle and other sort of cheese-associated animals, goats and sheep, in the area. And there are some records from places as far afield as Besançon, and another spot in southwestern France, or southeastern France, excuse me, trading cattle, most of all. There's also a surprise at the end of the archival file. Now, there was all this to do over who owned the property that Tingley had left behind. And after that was resolved, the Gatchina administration held a public auction to sell it all off. After a few debts were paid out of the income from the sale, there remained 1,092 rubles and 10 kopecks worth of stuff. So the Gatchina administration held on to this money, but it also took steps to find out if Tingley had heirs. They may have looked around a bit locally, although there aren't any particular notices of that in the file, at least. But in 1801, the Gatchina authorities wrote to the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, asking them to use their contacts to place a notice in a Hamburg newspaper announcing the cheese master's death and asking for any heirs to come forward to collect his estate. Now, what's sort of more amazing than that is that the advertisement worked. I don't know the exact mechanism of how this happened, but a few years after this, a letter came from Switzerland addressed to the Gatchina authorities, reporting that indeed Tingley had heirs in Switzerland. When he had left for Russia in 1791, he left behind, or frankly, I think probably abandoned, a wife and 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. Not only that, but according to this letter, shortly after Tingley left town, his wife died, leaving his 8 children to the charity of relatives, neighbors, and philanthropic institutions. Now, though, they were claiming their rights to Tingley's estate. And so the file ends, and in some ways Tingley's story does as well, with a notice from March 21st, 1804, so almost 5 years after his death, in which the Gatchina administration sent off 1,092 rubles and 10 kopecks to Switzerland to pass on to Tingley's heirs. Now, following this thread of Tingley's story is the last stage of research that I'd like to tell. At the end of one of my archival trips to St. Petersburg, in the last days of April, I flew to Switzerland to try to track down any records of Tingley's life there. There weren't many. I found the baptismal records for his actually 11 children. Only 8 were alive at the time of his departure, which is, of course, a sadly common part of sort of everyday life of the past. I found the record of his marriage to a woman named Françoise, the daughter of a man named Jean Magny. So in some ways, this trip didn't give me much new information about Tingley's life before his arrival in Russia. But it did give me a real understanding of the difficulty, if not impossibility, of the task he took on while he was working in the St. Petersburg area. When I left St. Petersburg at the very end of April, it was still gray and dreary and cold and just barely beginning to show signs of spring. And when I arrived in Switzerland that same day, it was lush and green and full of flowers. So right there was a clear reminder of the fact that this was somebody called to sort of engage in an agricultural world that was dramatically different in terms of environment from the one that he had left behind. When I was in Switzerland, in Fribourg in the area, I not only went to the archives, but also went to, say, Gruyere and to the regional museum of the Gruyere region. I learned of things like the Poya, and I have to show this lovely image, which was a yearly celebration when in the spring, cows were led up to the alpine pastures where they spent the summer, eating sort of beautiful alpine grasses, being milked, cheese being made up there on site, and then brought down and sold on. This is, of course, a different world than the one around Gatchina in almost every possible way. Gatchina is close to the sea. It's a marshier area. It's flat. Everything about the landscape is remarkably different. And at a very basic level, the terroir, which is something that cheese and wine basically uniquely have, was simply different. So the very task of trying to make Swiss cheese in this particular place was possibly a fool's errand to begin with. Perhaps this was actually at the crux of Tingley's sad experience in Gatchina, the impossibility of capturing this world of sort of beautiful Swiss cows being taken up to the mountains, with this one of, frankly, a sort of skinny and angry looking cow there looking at you. Well, maybe not a cow. Anyway, a bull looking at you, guarding over another sort of skinny cow, which is from this Russian landscape with cows from about the same time period. Now, when research travel becomes possible again, I'd love to visit Switzerland, and if you'll, that's unfortunate timing, and a few places nearby in search of more information about Tingley's life before he came to Russia, before I finally finished the project. I would still like to find out something about the impulse that pushed him or drew him to Russia. But I also know that many of the questions that come to mind may simply never be answered. And hopefully this talk and the eventual work that comes out of it will make it clear that even if it's impossible to answer every question, just the act of posing them and looking at what can be found is a valuable way of understanding more about the past. Thank you.